Now, so as you've understood now from the introduction that I made, it is possible, and it is actually imperative to read the frogs on many levels. So Michael Scott especially spoke about the historical political context, okay? And he spoke about the need for regeneration, for doing things differently, in reference to the historical, in reference to the political decisions of the Athenians and the historical context, okay? Comedy, however, works on many levels, and the level that I am going to analyze is the artistic level, the level that has to do with poetics, okay, and the role of poetry in society. Okay, now it is amazing. Like, few works of literary criticism have had an effect as drastic in shaping our perception of Greek tragedy as Aristophanes' play The Frogs has, which is not even a work of literary criticism, okay? It is a comedy, as we all know. Now, there is a belief, and I don't know if you have been taught this in schools, but it was still taught in your schools, but it was still taught at the school where I was, that the old tragedy of Aeschylus, okay, the father of comedy, was grand, okay, but rather primitive and kind of not very developed, epic, okay, but difficult and unapproachable for the common person. On the other hand, that Euripides, his attraction to these modern experimental intellectual ideas and these subversive ideas sometimes were responsible for the gradual degeneration of the tragic genre. Now, this idea that seriously was taught until very recently is largely, which is a distortion, as I will try to suggest, is largely down to the brilliant caricatures of the two tragic poets in Aristophanes' Frogs. Imagine what a big influence it has had, this play. No, and why has it had such a big influence? These perceptions were perpetuated and ossified by no other than Friedrich Nietzsche in his lectures and writings on Greek tragedy in the 19th century. So imagine that Nietzsche perpetuated these preconceptions about the two tragic playwrights. But although these perceptions are based on actual elements of the author's plays and styles, they're ultimately distortions, as I said. However, they are distortions with a fascinating background, and it is this background and its importance for making sense of the ending of the play that I want to explore in this lecture. So, now, because comedy, despite appearances, is a remarkably complex genre, and 1 hour of lecture would not go nowhere near enough to explain what happens in The Frogs, we sent you a couple of weeks ago to all of you guys an introduction to comedy, on which I'm hoping to build today. Now, I hope that you had time to listen to it. If not, let me say very briefly that the core of this introduction is that 5th century comedy, and Aristophanes especially, were obsessed with tragedy. Okay, Aristophanes, basically, as he does in The Frogs, parodied tragedy in every single one of his surviving plays. And that Frogs, like other comedies, put comic versions, comic caricatures of the two famous tragedians, Aeschylus and Euripides, on stage by characterizing them, and this is now important, not as individual personalities, but as caricatures of the way that their art was perceived by their audiences, okay? Not as personalities with feelings, but as caricatures of what their art represented in the minds of the audiences. So as I was explaining in that lecture, which is, by the way, video recorded, and you can watch it anytime from our website, in The Frogs, Aristophanes creates a stark contrast between Euripides and Aeschylus and how they were perceived by the audiences. So on one hand, and this is in the second part of the play, our Euripides is, as Aristophanes presents him, in that caricature. He's the poet of clever craft, like a really crafty poet, and also experimental use of language. And his poetry deals with issues closer to everyday life, much more democratic, much more audience-friendly, much more approachable to the audiences. Okay, this is the caricature. And also exciting and mesmerizing for the masses, but the masses, okay, not the educated people. But also who is subversive of tradition, including the traditional religion. So there is a sense of danger always surrounding poor Euripides. Now, the Aristophanic Aeschylus, on the other hand, see now, because I mean, you have Euripides on one hand, you have to have the, in one extreme, you have to have Aeschylus on the other extreme. The Aristophanic Aeschylus is presented as the poet of raw power, okay, and natural inspiration. So no craft here, no kind of chiseling and cutting, and as Euripides is presented. So strong natural imagery with this kind of raw power. His language flows like a powerful stream of water and has the weight of Homeric epic. So loads of chariots, loads of horses, loads of crests and helmets. His poetry deals only with noble themes, nothing from everyday life. And also he conceals morally reprehensible aspects of life. Okay, because as if Aeschylus would ever present adultery on stage. Of course, we all know that Clytemnestra wasn't an adulterer. Of course, you can see how this is in fact a distortion, okay? And who also upholds tradition and appeals to the few, but noble, okay? The kaloi kagathoi. So this is the two extremes that Aristophanes presents in his, in the agon of the frogs, in the competition of the frogs between the two poets. Now, to understand the reasons why Aristophanes chose to portray the two tragic poets in these terms, one should look at the intellectual and artistic context in which the comic poet composed his plays. In the 5th century, comedy, as we said, was a genre that fiercely rivaled tragedy. Okay, tragedy was at the time an overwhelmingly dominant cultural phenomenon, reigning supreme in the Athenian performance scene. In the dramatic festivals that I told you in the Great Dionysia, 3 days were occupied by tragedy, 1 day by comedy. Okay? And I mean, it had basically overshadowed, other performances, which until recently, until, the 6th century would have themselves been the stars, like performances of lyric poetry, of performances of epic. Now, in this crowded cultural environment, as soon as comedy was granted an official place at the dramatic festival, it develops a deeply competitive attitude towards tragedy, and it kind of elbows and fights to make space for itself, and it fights to be taken as seriously as tragedy in its role in the polis, and also fighting for its survival in the Greek canon. Okay? It wants to be taken as seriously as tragedy. So as a result, from its very beginnings, comedy made a target of the tragic plays that delighted the audiences in Athens and all around the Greek world. As we can see from the surviving plays and fragments, comedy openly rivaled tragedy, made fun of it, rejected it, distorted it, pointed to its flaws, its inconsistencies and its absurdities, okay, its artificial language, and subverted it. At the same time, it is clear its obsession with tragedy reveals a deep fascination and admiration for the tragic genre. And as such, it gives comedy ample opportunities to define itself as a genre. For Aristophanes especially, it has become a pervasive preoccupation. In fact, there is no Aristophanic comedy which does not engage, to some level at least, with the cultural phenomenon of tragedy. Tragedy, in other words, becomes a constant point of reference on which poets, and Aristophanes especially, models himself as a poet. Okay? But well before Aristophanes, other comic poets had entered the arena of doing comedy through tragedy, or doing tragicomedy, or comic tragedy. So notably, Cratinus. Okay, Cratinus, I don't know if you've noticed him in your texts of the frogs, But Cratinus was one of the three canonical poets of ancient comedy, like as we say today, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, the three canonical tragedians, the three canonical comedians is Cratinus, Eupolis, and Aristophanes. His plays haven't survived, only in fragments, but in the fragments that have survived, we see extensive parody of Aeschylus, especially the Oresteia and the Prometheus trilogy. Most impressively of all, now this is where it all starts. Cratinus, in the years before Aristophanes started his career, had defined himself as the Aeschylus of comedy. And why is this? Because in the 430s, that Cratinus was developing his career, Aeschylus had already been recognized as a canonical classic, okay, as the golden standard of tragedy. So, as the father of tragedy. So Cratinus, wanting to bask, in the sun of his older playwright, tragic playwright Aeschylus, and appropriating also the status he had in the minds of the Athenians, presented himself through his own plays as doing the new Aeschylus. Okay, now I am the Aeschylus of comedy. I wish I could show you fragments. We don't have the time now. Please email me if you want me to send you things that show all of these things that I'm saying. Now, when Aristophanes entered the comic competitions of the 420s, it wasn't only Cratinus that aligned himself and modeled himself on this, Aeschylus, but it was actually a common tactic for poets to align themselves with a major artistic personality. Of the cultural scene. So different poets, for example, had aligned themselves with Homer, with Hesiod, with Solon, Archilochus. Okay, I'm the new Homer, and I'm the new Solon. So for the rising star Aristophanes, this kind of self-representation needed an answer, and the answer was long overdue. So in the earliest play that we have from Aristophanes, one of his earliest plays, 425 BC, The Men of Acharnae, Aristophanes modeled himself, as opposed to Cratinus as Aeschylus, modeled himself on Euripides. Okay, and he continued actually to do so for a couple of decades. Now, what is the basis of this self-modeling of Aeschylus, of Aristophanes on Euripides, as opposed to the old glory of Aeschylus? Aristophanes contrasted now to that, presenting it as better, the modern inventiveness of Euripides. He also used as basis of his and Euripides' shared genius the idea that both poets were innovators, okay? And they did new things with their art, the old and allegedly tired art, comedy and tragedy. At the time, actually, Euripides was known as an innovator, okay? With music, with content, with form. So what Aristophanes is arguing here has a basis on reality. But Aristophanes takes it much further. So aligning himself now with that perception, he claims now that he does Euripides. So his comedy is innovative. His comedy is experimental, original, and far from repetitive. And in contrast, he presented his rivals as old has-beens who, having run out of ideas, had brought the art of comedy to the level of cheap farce. Now, those of you who have read The Frogs remember the first 100 lines of Frogs, where there is talk between Dionysus and his slave about doing cheap comedy and how everybody else does cheap comedy, but only they don't do. Only that, Dionysus, the things that he denies that he does, actually they do, because there's this thing about baggage and wanting to shift the load, to take a piece and to take a crap and all of these things. And in the end, you can see the jokes that they deny, but they're actually there, okay? So on one hand, you deny repetitiveness and low quality, and on the other hand, this is what you do. So very slippery kind of style of comedy. So furthermore, for Aristophanes, good art innovation came from learnedness and home technique. So as opposed to his older rivals, whom he portrayed as composing comedy by relying on some dubious form of inspiration, Aristophanes claimed that he composed Greek comedy thanks to his vast library of books, to his vast knowledge of other poetry, as well as to his great skill, his craftiness. In comedy's relentlessly physical imagination, skill, now poetic skill, becomes a craft. Carpentry, okay, chiseling, cutting, planing. An inspiration, on the other hand, becomes a reliance on alcohol, in fact. So Aristophanes constructed his master poet Euripides as a crafty individual, and ultimately as a master builder, as we see in the Frogs. And also he presented Cratinus, his old comic rival, who claimed to be inspired by Dionysus, as a mere drunk, okay, who wet his bed, this is actually taken from the fragments, and could not fulfill also his conjugal duties in bed. Okay, he could not have an erection in bed and have sex with his wife comedy. Because as this last joke suggests, comic poets connected artistic creativity with sexual prowess, okay, and fertility. Capitalizing on this connection, Aristophanes presents himself as the boyfriend of comedy, and on the other hand, brands Cratinus as an old drunk who cannot get it up. So, I mean, there are actually, email me, I'll send you all of these things. Okay, so look, okay, I didn't get the erection joke here, but this is, for example, a passage from an Aristophanic comedy where he talks about his rival Cratinus. Is then our poet remembered Cratinus, this is the comic chorus now talking, who once, gushing with your love's applause, this is Cratinus, used to flow through the plains of simple art, and uproot oaks, plane trees, and rivals, presenting now Cratinus as a raw force of nature, okay, sweep them from their places and bear them downstream. But now you take no pity of him, though you see him driveling, with his pegs falling out, his tuning gone, okay, his music has kind of disintegrated, and joints gaping. In his old days, he wanders about like Conas, wearing a garland old and sere, and all but dead with thirst from drinking. When in honor of his former victories, he ought to be drinking in the Prytaneum, and instead of spouting drivel, should be sitting sleek-faced in the audience by the side of Dionysus. So this is what, one of the many passages of put-downs of Cratinus. Now, why am I saying all of these things? Now, we're doing Frogs here, no? So, this is in fact, this contrast that I analyzed until now is largely, the background for us to understand the poetic level, the poetic layer of the Frogs. So this contrast between the old and inspired poets, namely people like Cratinus and Aeschylus, and on the other hand, new and technical poets, namely Aristophanes and Euripides. And now let's remind ourselves of the beginning of the play, okay? So when the play starts, Dionysus has set off on a journey in search of good poetry. Namely, poetry, as we said, that is capable of regenerating the dead cultural life of Athens. At this point, Dionysus' passion for everything modern and experimental suggests, we see him saying that, we see him saying that he believes that good poetry is embodied in Euripides, the poet of innovation and experimentation. Dionysus, the hero of our comedy, in other words, largely expresses the voice of Aristophanes. Okay, I'll get to that in a minute. In many ways, so let me see why this is the case. So this is in the beginning of the play. This is how we see Dionysus' belief about what constitutes good poetry. So he says things like, well, that's the kind of longing that eating away at me for Euripides. I need a talented poet. For some are gone, this is a direct quotation, and those that live are bad. And he goes on, when he's challenged by Hercules, he goes on to say, the poets that are alive are cast-offs and empty chatter, choirs of swallows, wreckers of their art, who maybe get a chorus and are soon forgotten after their single piece against tragedy. But if you look, this single piece is a contrast to proper fertile semen. But if you look for a fertile poet, one who could utter a lordly phrase, you won't find any left. See that here, subconsciously, if you can say that for comedy, Dionysus says that he wants somebody who is not crafty, but who is naturally fertile. This is what the Greek says, gonimos. So this is now what I try to show you is the number one key for us understanding the frogs. But there is a number two key as well, which is this. Now this is the new thing. This is now how I want you to understand the role of the initiates in the frogs, okay? Now the whole of the frogs is built like a journey, like a rite of passage, okay, for the hero, for the god of the theatre. What I mean by rite of passage is a journey through which, I mean, it's known in ritual across many cultures, is a journey, a symbolic journey, through which an individual dies symbolically as his previous self and becomes regenerated as his new self, okay? So we see that, for example, in rites of passage such as baptism, okay, that's a rite of passage. So the initiant there dies as his non-initiated self and he gets regenerated as his new self. The same thing, so by all going to the underworld, here Dionysus gets initiated, so he dies as his older self, and when he sets off to return, he has become regenerated. Now, why is this? This spatial journey, going down and up again, is very important for us to understand this death and regeneration. Why? Because a major quality of the underworld in Greek imagination is that it is not only a place of death, but at the same time, and very importantly, and you'll see that in imagery, iconography, in Greek texts everywhere, it's also the place where life comes back from. Okay, so death goes in the earth, earth produces new life. Okay, and this is part also of the Eleusinian mysteries that Michael was talking to you about. So, and the evidence that this actually rite of passage exists is that Dionysus encounters these initiates, okay, and he himself becomes one of them. So as he gets initiated in the mysteries, he becomes a new man. Okay, now, these two keys, let's bring them together. First of all, the key of Dionysus' preference for Euripides all his life, and we said, and I will explain further how this embodies Aristophanes as well, on one hand, and on the other hand, what we said is the process of regeneration, okay, and his change into a new man. Now here is where I'm going to explain why Dionysus, in fact, evokes the Aristophanic voice, okay, the Aristophanic poet. Because if you think that about the change that is at the very heart of the play, is in fact, instead of the preference for Euripides, is now the preference for Aeschylus. So this is, in my opinion, what allows us, to think and at the same time recapitulate about who hides behind that Dionysiac journey, who hides behind that hero of this poetry, of this play, who hides behind this change from Euripidean to Aeschylean. And I think this is, of course, Aristophanes, or his persona, the persona that he has constructed throughout his career. So I believe that we're justified to read the journey of Aristophanes also as a poetic journey of no other than the poet Aristophanes himself. okay? And therefore, to put it in a different ways, in many ways Dionysus embodies the poet Aristophanes going on a poetic journey in search of what constitutes creative, fertile poetry, okay? Poetry that, as they recognize, is not the poetry of craftiness and carpentry and bookishness and technique, but it's the poetry of natural, raw powers and energies. In other words, Euripidean Aristophanes becomes Aeschylean by the end of the play. Thus, we can put the frogs in the context of other plays that we said were produced and performed in the course of the 420s and 410s and then 400s. Now, how is this change facilitated? It's actually not far from something that happens gradually, far from something that happens suddenly in the course of the play. It actually happens gradually. And the parabases that the parabasis also has reference to old, but the parodos, where the initiates come in, has a reference to Cratinus, and for the first time we see a positive reference to Cratinus as not only a Dionysiac poet, but even Dionysus himself. And also, I mean, there's a lot of other things, but also the whole atmosphere of the play is pervaded by a Dionysiac spirit, very much a non-Euripidean spirit, including a desire for transformation, a longing for things to change from what they have been. Now, of course, I don't want you to perceive this interpretation of the play as ahistorical or apolitical, because this pattern of regeneration, of the poetic voice, of the poetic persona of Aristophanes, is deeply connected with other themes of the play. And the emphasis that the play gives on this change for regeneration. The need for change and regeneration. As you will see in our production, the play criticizes new attitudes to politics. Okay, so there's the new politicians that you're trusting now are useless. We need to trust the old politicians. Deplores the unreliability of the new politicians as well, connects them with sophistry and Euripides, expresses the desire to go back to the old values, and urges the citizens to trust the tried and tested citizens once again. Now, the question is, you can't take this as an earnest plea, okay? Unfortunately, comedy we're not used to a very black and white discourse in comedy. Comedy is often slippery and often subverts itself. I gave you an example at the beginning of Frogs, where Aristophanes, through Dionysus, deplores the farcical, scatological humor of his rivals, and then nevertheless he does it himself in the Frogs. So there is the kind of this destabilization. Nevertheless, okay, so we have this earnest plea, what looks like earnest plea from Aristophanes, about change and going back to the old values. Should we take this plea as an earnest plea? Or is this one more Aristophanic trick? And here, I'd like you to show you and to suggest that actually, although Aristophanes is advocating going traditional, still through this comedy, he advocates change and regeneration. So he has not, in fact, stopped being innovative, okay, being surprising, doing something new. So he changes himself, he changes his discourse. So already destabilized discourse there from Aristophanes. On the other hand, I cannot deny that the play, as Michael suggested, does seem to strike a key with audiences. But I want to leave this open, and I think that would have made Aristophanes the happiest. And that comedy's discourse is notoriously slippery. It makes you think, it makes you reflect, and it's ultimately up to you to decide what the final point is.